The morning of the fire began like any other in the small, close-knit village of Willowbrook. 10-year-old twins Amara and Zane raced each other down the cobblestone path to school, their laughter ringing like wind chimes in the crisp autumn air. They were inseparable. Amara, with her wild curls and a smile that could melt winter ice, Zane with his thoughtful eyes and a habit of finishing his sister's sentences. The entire town adored them, not just for their mischief, but for their kindness, the way they'd leave handmade cards for grieving neighbors or share their lunch with stray dogs, but that very kindness would soon become their undoing. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, smoke began to curl from the windows of their grandmother's cottage. The twins, who had been playing in the garden, were the first to notice. Without hesitation, they bolted inside, ignoring the shouts of neighbors. Later, witnesses would say they heard Amara scream, "Nana's still in her room," a sentence that would haunt the town forever. The fire swallowed the house. In minutes, the flames roaring like a beast unleashed. By the time the firefighters arrived, it was too late. The twins were found curled together near their grandmother's bed, their small hands clasped tightly, as if, even in death, they refused to be parted. The tragedy shattered Willowbrook. The twins' parents, Mr. and Mrs. Harlow, became hollow, shells moving through the days like ghosts. The funeral was arranged under a sky so gray it seemed the heavens themselves were mourning. The tiny white casket, adorned with twin wreaths of lilies, stood at the center of the church surrounded by weeping mourners. Just as the priest began the final prayer, a hush fell over the crowd. A figure emerged from the back, a hunched, old woman in a tattered shawl, her face obscured by shadows. No one recognized her, yet something about her presence made the air grow heavy, as if time itself had slowed. She moved with eerie purpose, her gnarled fingers brushing the casket's lid. Then, in a voice like rustling leaves, she whispered words no one could understand. The church lights flickered violently. A gasp rippled through the crowd as the casket trembled, just slightly, but enough. A child's scream pierced the silence. "Their hands moved. I saw it." Panic erupted. Doctors rushed forward, but before they could intervene, a little girl named Lila, the twins' best friend, burst into tears. "Last night, Amara and Zane came to me in a dream," she sobbed. "They told me to stop the burial." The old woman vanished as suddenly as she'd appeared, leaving behind a stunned silence and a single question hanging in the air. What had just happened? And why did the twins' final moments feel like a secret waiting to be uncovered? The church erupted into chaos. Mourners whispered frantically, some clutching their chests in shock, others backing away as if the casket itself had become something unnatural. The priest, Father Donovan, a man who had served Willowbrook for decades, stood frozen at the altar, his Bible trembling in his hands. He had seen many miracles in his time, or so he claimed, but nothing like this. The twins' parents, Mr. and Mrs. Harlow, collapsed to their knees, their grief momentarily eclipsed by a desperate, clawing hope. Had their children truly moved? Was there still life in those small, still bodies? The doctors, two local physicians who had pronounced the twins dead days before, exchanged uneasy glances. They had checked for pulses, for breath. There had been none. Yet now, as they hesitantly approached the casket, the air itself seemed charged with something inexplicable. Leela, the little girl who had spoken of the dream, was inconsolable. Her mother held her tightly, but the child's words spilled out between sobs. "They were standing in a field, a golden field," she cried. "Amara said they weren't ready to leave. Zane told me to find the lady in the shawl, the one who could help." The villagers exchanged bewildered glances. Who was this mysterious old woman, and why had she disappeared so suddenly? The townspeople began murmuring about signs, about spirits, about things that defied logic. Some claimed the woman had been a ghost. Others whispered she was a witch, a guardian, or something far older than any of them could comprehend. Then, from the back of the church, came a slow, deliberate clap. The crowd turned to see Mayor Whitlock, a stern man who prided himself on his rationality, his face tight with disapproval. "Enough of this nonsense," he boomed. "These children are gone. Let them rest." His words were like a bucket of cold water, dousing the flickers of hope that had begun to rise. But Mrs. Harlow, her tear-streaked face hardening with sudden defiance, stood up. "No," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "Not until we know for sure." The room fell silent again, the tension so thick it was suffocating. Just then, the church doors creaked open, and a gust of wind rushed in, extinguishing half the candles. A collective shiver ran through the crowd. Standing in the doorway was the old woman again, her shawl now pulled back to reveal piercing silver eyes that seemed to glow in the dim light. "You want answers," she said, her voice carrying an unnatural weight, as if each word were echoing from somewhere far away. "Then listen carefully. The children are not in that casket, not entirely. Their souls are caught between worlds, and if you bury them now, they will never find peace." A stunned silence followed. Then, from the casket came a sound no one could deny, a faint but unmistakable knock. The knock sent the room into pandemonium. People screamed, some fainted, others surged forward, their fear overtaken by a desperate need to see, to understand. The doctors, their professional skepticism crumbling, rushed to the casket and pried open the lid. Inside, the twins lay just as they had been, pale, still, their faces serene in death. But then, as the crowd held its breath, Zane's eyelid twitched. A collective gasp tore through the church. Mrs. Harlow let out a strangled cry, her hands flying to her mouth. The old woman stepped forward, her silver eyes burning with an intensity that made even Mayor Whitlock step back. "They are not dead," she said, "but they are not alive. Not yet." The woman introduced herself only as Mara, a name that sent a ripple of recognition through the oldest members of the village. Old Mrs. Peabody, the town's eldest resident, clutched her, rosary tighter. "Mara," she whispered. "The name means bitter in the old tongue, but also guide." Mara ignored the murmurs, her gaze fixed on the twins. She reached into the folds of her shawl and pulled out a small, ornate vial filled with a liquid that shimmered like liquid moonlight. Without explanation, she uncorked it and let a single drop fall onto each of the twins' lips. The moment the liquid touched them, the church lights flared so brightly that everyone had to shield their eyes. When the light faded, the twins' chests were rising and falling. Shallow but undeniable. They were breathing. The doctors, their hands shaking, confirmed it. There were pulses, faint but steady. The crowd erupted into sobs of joy, of terror, of disbelief. But Mara's expression remained grave. "This is only temporary," she warned. "Their souls are still lost. To bring them back fully, you must uncover the truth of how they really died." Mr. Harlow, his voice breaking, demanded, "What do you mean? They died in the fire, trying to save my mother." Mara's eyes darkened. "Are you certain?" Before anyone could respond, a new voice cut through the noise. It was Lila again, her small hand tugging at her mother's sleeve. "The fire wasn't an accident," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "Amara and Zane told me, in the dream. They said someone locked the doors." A chilling silence followed. The villagers exchanged horrified glances. If the fire hadn't been an accident, if someone had trapped the twins and their grandmother inside, then this was no tragedy. It was murder. The revelation that the fire might have been deliberate sent shockwaves through the grieving crowd. Mr. Harlow's face twisted in fury, his hands clenching into fists as he turned to scan the room, as if the culprit might be standing among them, hidden behind masks of sympathy. Mrs. Harlow clutched her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps, the weight of the accusation too monstrous to bear. The twins, though breathing, remained unconscious, their small bodies caught in a limbo between life and death, their souls tethered to something, or someone, that refused to let them go. Mara, the mysterious old woman, stood silently near, the casket, her silver eyes scanning the faces in the room with an unsettling intensity, as though she could see the guilt lurking behind any one of them. The villagers began murmuring among themselves, voices hushed but frantic. Old grudges, long-buried secrets, and whispered suspicions rose to the surface like ghosts refusing to stay forgotten. The fire had been too sudden, too fierce. Some had wondered at the time how it had spread so quickly, and now, with Lila's claim that the doors had been locked from the outside, the unthinkable became unavoidable. Someone had wanted the twins and their grandmother dead. But who, and why? The twins had been beloved by everyone, or so it had seemed. Mayor Whitlock, his face pale but his voice steady, stepped forward, attempting to restore order. "This is a serious accusation," he said, his tone measured. "We cannot jump to conclusions. The fire inspectors ruled it an accident, faulty wiring in the old house." But his words rang hollow, even to his own ears. Mara let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "The dead do not lie," she said, "and these children are not at rest. If you wish to save them, you must listen." She turned to Lila, her gaze softening just slightly. "Child, what else did they tell you?" Lila hesitated, her small fingers twisting in the fabric of her dress. They said to look for the silver key," she whispered. "It's hidden where the flowers never bloom." A ripple of confusion passed through the crowd. The Harlow family exchanged bewildered glances. What key? What did it mean? But Mrs. Peabody, the eldest in the village, suddenly straightened, her wrinkled face paling. "The old well," she breathed. "Behind the church. Nothing grows there, no matter how much we tend to it." The villagers turned as one toward the churchyard, where the abandoned well stood, half covered in ivy, a place long avoided by the superstitious. Without another word, Mara strode toward the doors, her tattered shawl billowing behind her like a shadow given life. The crowd parted before her, some out of fear, others out of desperate hope. Mr. Harlow, his jaw set, followed without hesitation, the rest of the villagers trailing behind in a stunned, murmuring procession. The twins' casket remained in the church, their shallow breaths the only sign that they lingered between worlds. As the group reached the well, its stones weathered and cracked with age, Mara knelt and pressed her palm against the earth. "Dig," she commanded. No one moved at first. Then, with a shuddering breath, Mr. Harlow grabbed a nearby shovel and drove it into the hard-packed dirt. The sound of metal striking something hollow made everyone freeze. He dropped to his knees, scrabbling at the soil with his bare hands until his fingers closed around a small, tarnished silver box. The villagers crowded closer, their breaths held. With trembling hands, Mr. Harlow pried it open. Inside lay a single key and a folded, yellowed photograph. When he unfolded it, his blood ran cold. It was a picture of the twins' grandmother, decades younger, standing beside a man whose face had been torn away. Scrawled on the back were 2 words: "Forgive me." The photograph shook in Mr. Harlow's hands as he stared at it, his mind racing. Who was this man? And why had his face been ripped from the image? His mother had never spoken of any great secrets, never hinted at a past filled with betrayal or regret. Yet here was proof, undeniable and unsettling, that something dark had been buried long before the fire. Mrs. Harlow reached for the picture, her fingers brushing against the torn edge, her breath catching as she recognized her mother-in-law's youthful face. "This doesn't make sense," she whispered. "She never mentioned anyone like this." Mara's voice cut through the murmurs of the crowd. "Secrets have weight," she said. "They fester, and sometimes they burn." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Had the fire been set to erase the past? To ensure that whatever truth lay buried with the grandmother stayed buried? The villagers shifted uneasily, their eyes darting to one another, as though the killer could be standing among them even now. Mayor Whitlock cleared his throat, his usual authority wavering. "We need to take this to the authorities," he said. "If there's evidence of foul play, the police won't find what they're not meant to see," Mara interrupted, her voice sharp. She turned back to Mr. Harlow. "The key. Do you know what it opens?" He shook his head, turning the small silver object over in his palm. It was old, intricately designed, the kind of key that belonged to a box or a drawer. Something meant to keep secrets locked away. Then, like a bolt of lightning, a memory struck him. "The writing desk," he said suddenly. "My mother's old writing desk. It had a hidden compartment, but she never let anyone open it." The villagers exchanged glances. The grandmother's belongings had been moved to the Harlow family's attic after the fire, most of them untouched in the wake of grief. Without another word, Mr. Harlow turned on his heel and strode back toward his house, the crowd following in his wake like a silent, determined tide. Mara walked at the front, her presence both unsettling and magnetic, as though she were leading them not just to answers, but to something far greater, something that straddled the line between the living and the dead. Inside the Harlows' home, the air was thick with the scent of morning. Fresh flowers, candle wax, the faint lingering odor of smoke that no amount of cleaning could erase. Mr. Harlow led the way up the narrow attic stairs, his heart pounding with every step. The writing desk stood in the corner, draped in a dusty sheet, its polished wood dulled by neglect. With shaking hands, he pulled the sheet away and ran his fingers along the carved edges until he found the nearly invisible seam of the hidden drawer. The silver key slid in with a soft click. The drawer opened with a sigh, as though it had been waiting decades for this moment. Inside lay a stack of letters, tied with a faded ribbon and a single, dried white rose. Mr. Harlow untied the bundle with careful fingers, his breath catching as he unfolded the first letter. The handwriting was his mother's, but the words were not meant for him. "My dearest Joseph," it began. "If you're reading this, then you finally come back. Or someone has found what we tried to bury." A collective gasp rose from the villagers crowding the attic. Joseph. The name meant nothing to the younger generation, but Mrs. Peabody's sharp intake of breath was unmistakable. "Joseph Carter," she whispered. "He left the village 60 years ago. No one ever knew why." Mara's lips curled into a knowing smile, though her eyes remained sorrowful. "And now we know," she murmured. Mr. Harlow continued reading, his voice growing hoarse with each word. The letters told a story of a love affair gone wrong, of a man who had promised to return but never did, of a secret so devastating it had forced the grandmother to lock it away forever. But the final letter was different. It was recent, dated, just weeks before the fire. "He's back," it said. "After all these years, Joseph has returned, and he knows the truth about the twins." The room spun. Mr. Harlow's legs gave way and he sank to the floor, the letters spilling from his hands. What truth? What did that mean? Before anyone could speak, a weak, rasping voice came from the doorway. Everyone turned, and there, supported by two stunned neighbors, stood Amara and Zayn, their eyes open, their faces pale but alive. "We remember," Amara whispered, and then the world exploded into chaos. The sight of the twins standing there, alive, breathing, their small frames trembling with exhaustion but undeniably present, sent a wave of disbelief through the room. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke, as if the sheer impossibility of their return had frozen time itself. Then Mrs. Harlow let out a strangled cry, rushing forward to gather them into her arms, her body shaking with sobs as she clutched them to her chest, as if afraid they might vanish if she let go. Mr. Harlow stumbled to his feet, his face a mask of shock and dawning hope, his hands outstretched as though to confirm they were real. The villagers crowded closer, murmurs of awe and fear intertwining, their eyes wide with wonder, but the twins didn't react with the relief of children reunited with their parents. Instead, their expressions were haunted, their gazes distant, as though they were still half-trapped in whatever world they had just returned from. Amara was the first to speak, her voice a fragile thread of sound. "We saw her," she whispered. "Nana. She told us we had to come back, that it wasn't our time." Zane nodded, his fingers tightening around his sister's wrist as if to anchor himself. "She said we had to tell you," he added, his voice barely audible. "About the man, the one who came back." The room seemed to grow colder at his words. Mara stepped forward then, her silver eyes gleaming with something like satisfaction, or perhaps grim understanding. "The dead do not lie," she repeated softly, "and they do not rest when there is unfinished business." The twins' revelation sent a ripple of unease through the villagers. Joseph Carter, the man from the letters, the one who had vanished decades ago, had returned, and according to the grandmother's final letter, he knew something about the twins. But what? Mr. Harlow's mind raced, his grip tightening on the letters still clutched in his hand. What truth could be so dangerous that it had led to murder? He turned to the twins, his voice rough with emotion. "What else did Nana tell you?" he asked. "Do you know why someone would want to hurt her? To hurt you?" Amara and Zane exchanged a glance, their silence heavy with unspoken fear. Then, slowly, Amara reached into the pocket of her dress, the same one she had been wearing the night of the fire, though it should have been reduced to ashes, and pulled out a small charred photograph. It was partially burned, the edges blackened, but the image was still clear enough to make out. A younger version of their grandmother, standing beside a man who was unmistakably Joseph Carter. But what made the room gasp was the child in the photograph. A little girl with the same wild curls as Amara, the same thoughtful eyes as Zane. A girl who looked exactly like them. Nana said, "We're not the first twins," Zane whispered. The words landed like a thunderclap. Mrs. Harlow's hands flew to her mouth, her knees buckling as the implication struck her. The villagers erupted into frantic whispers, the pieces of the puzzle suddenly falling into place with terrible clarity. Joseph Carter hadn't just been a lover who abandoned the grandmother. He was the father of her first set of twins. Twins, who, by some dark twist of fate, had met a tragic end. And now, history had repeated itself. The fire hadn't been an accident. It had been revenge. Mara's voice cut through the chaos, her tone leaving no room for doubt. "Joseph Carter didn't just come back for the past," she said. "He came back for them." Her gaze settled on Amara and Zane, her expression unreadable. Because lightning never strikes the same place twice, unless it's meant to. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the attic windows like an omen. Somewhere in the village, a man who had been waiting in the shadows for decades was still out there, and now he knew the twins had returned. The revelation that Joseph Carter was not just a specter from the past but a living, breathing threat sent a wave of panic through the Harlows' home. Mr. Harlow's hands clenched into fists, his protective instincts roaring to life. If this man had set the fire to erase the twins once, he would try again. The villagers, sensing the danger, began murmuring about forming search parties, about alerting the authorities, but Mara raised a hand, silencing them. "He will not be found unless he wishes to be," she said, her voice low and certain. "And he will come. Now that he knows the children live, he will not rest until he finishes what he started." Amara and Zane, though weak, refused to be sidelined. There was a new determination in their eyes, a fire that hadn't been there before, as though their brush with death had stripped away their childhood innocence and replaced it with something harder, sharper. "We have to stop him," Amara said, her voice steadier now. "Nana told us how." Zane nodded, reaching into his pocket once more. This time he withdrew a small, intricately carved wooden pendant, a twin to the one their grandmother had always worn around her neck. The villagers leaned in, their breaths held. Mrs. Peabody's eyes widened. "The twin mark," she whispered. "It's an old protection charm. She must have given it to them before—" Her voice trailed off, but the meaning was clear. "Before she died." Mara took the pendant, turning it over in her gnarled hands. "This is more than a charm," she murmured. "It's a key to the place where it began." She looked up, her silver eyes locking onto the twins. "You must go to the old oak tree at the heart of the forest. That's where your grandmother made her promise. That's where Joseph Carter will be waiting." The villagers erupted into protests. Sending the children into danger was unthinkable, but the twins stood firm. "We have to," Zane insisted. "It's the only way to end this." Mrs. Harlow sobbed, clutching at them, but Mr. Harlow, after a long, agonized moment, nodded. "We'll go with them," he said. "All of us. If Joseph wants them, he'll have to go through me first." The resolve in his voice steeled the crowd. One by one, the villagers stepped forward, their fear giving way to determination. They would protect the twins, not just for their sake, but for the grandmother, for the truth, for the future of Willowbrook itself. As the group prepared to leave, Mara pulled the twins aside. "You must be ready," she told them, her voice barely above a whisper. "Joseph Carter is not just a man. He is a man who has lived with grief for 60 years. Grief can make people into monsters." Amara swallowed hard but nodded. "We're not afraid," she lied. Mara smiled faintly and pressed the pendant back into Zane's hand. "You should be," she said. "But fear will keep you alive." The journey to the old oak was tense, the forest unnaturally silent, as though the trees themselves were holding their breath. The oak stood in a clearing, its gnarled branches stretching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. And there, beneath its shadow, stood a figure, tall, gaunt, his face lined with decades of bitterness. Joseph Carter. His eyes, cold and hollow, locked onto the twins, and for a moment no one moved. Then he spoke, his voice like dry leaves scraping against stone. "You were supposed to die," he said, "just like the others." The others. The words confirmed the terrible truth. The grandmother had lost her first twins, Joseph's children, long ago, and now he had returned to ensure she felt that pain again. But before anyone could react, the pendant in Zane's hand began to glow, a soft, golden light spreading through the clearing. The ground beneath their feet trembled, and from the shadows of the oak, a figure emerged, translucent, shimmering, but undeniably their grandmother. Her voice, when she spoke, was not the gentle tone they remembered, but something fiercer, older. "It ends now, Joseph," she said. What happened next was a blur. A rush of wind, a flash of light, a cry that seemed to come from the earth itself. When the chaos cleared, Joseph Carter was gone, the pendant reduced to ashes in Zane's hand. The villagers stood in stunned silence, the weight of what they had just witnessed settling over them. The twins, exhausted but unharmed, sank to their knees, their grandmother's spirit fading with one final whispered word: "Live." Back in Willowbrook, the days that followed were filled with tears, with questions, with the slow, painful process of healing. The twins, though forever changed, were alive, truly alive. And as for Mara, she vanished as mysteriously as she had. Ithiu arrived, leaving behind only a single white rose on the grandmother's grave. But sometimes, on quiet evenings, when the wind rustles through the trees just so, the villagers swear they can hear laughter, childlike and bright, as though the twins are not alone when they play, as though somewhere beyond the veil their grandmother is watching and smiling.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.